out some of the banks like Lloyds and RBS. RBS in particular had a big PFI interest, and so if you like, the PFI investment is brought into the public sector as a result of taking over those banks. And in March 2009, the government sets up the Infrastructure Finance Unit, because these schemes are drying up, to provide public money to ensure these PFI schemes are carried through. So I suggest we then had the PFI, the publicly funded private finance initiative. You know, you couldn't make this up. If you tried to write a novel, it would be rejected by publishers. So that's the financial crisis. And then, with a change of government, PFI gets investigated by the House of Commons Treasury Committee and by the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee, and they take evidence and they come up with things that, alas, academics like me and many others have been saying for years, but we're not listened to, clearly, about the problem of lack of innovation, the rigidity of the infrastructure arrangements, how expensive it is, the absence of risk transfer, and they come up with all these problems with PFI. And so it gets resurrected as PF2, Private Finance 2, with some interesting ideas, I think, about putting more equity into these schemes, including a public sector share of the equity, about getting influence through public sector board membership of the operating companies, trying to prevent windfall gains through using life cycle reserves. So I think some interesting ideas, together with a lot of rhetoric about how from now on everything's going to be fine, don't worry. So a combination of things there. So PF2, I think that's something to look out for. In Birmingham, everybody knows about HS2, the high-speed train number 2, with very mixed views, I should say, about whether it's any benefit at all for Birmingham. It's really made for London, of course. It isn't made for Birmingham, is it? But very few have heard of PF2, so I think that's to come. I don't know what we learned from that. Did we learn that any project which has a code letter has a 3-digit code ending in a number 2, we should be careful of? I don't know whether that's a conclusion we make. Okay, so PFI gets investigated and it gets resurrected. So where do we go from here? Are RUBs guaranteed? Okay, I'm going to think about green energy, about housing, and about nuclear power stations as a few examples. Are RUBs guaranteed? In the words of Churchill, oh yes. Let's start with green energy. I think this is quite interesting. The government have sought to promote green energy through a scheme which is essentially a sort of tax and spend scheme. So there's meant to be a levy on non-green energy producers and then a subsidy provided for producers of green energy. And the basic idea was that the public sector, the taxpayer, you and me, we're neutral in all this. Okay, there's levies and there's subsidies. The problem for us is that, I guess, as citizens, we like the idea of green energy. We like that bit, but we don't like paying for it. So it seems to me we end up with a problem that now we have the energy companies saying that the main reason for their price increases is this green energy levy. You can believe that or not. And the government clearly backtracking on this, and maybe we're aiming towards the elimination of this. There won't be a levy on green energy because we don't like paying for it, and politicians want our votes, understandably. So we don't want that bit. Suddenly, therefore, it seems to me, this subsidy here actually becomes effectively a guarantee. If the government pull out of the levy, they're still committed, it seems to me, to the green energy producers to provide that subsidy. Okay, so we may have a situation very soon where this balance actually results in additional obligations to the public sector. The second one I wanted to look at was help to buy mortgages. For those of you unfamiliar with this process, basically the government are subsidising, are guaranteeing parts of the deposit on mortgages on private houses from individuals. Which seems to me to be based on an assumption that house prices will continue to move upwards, so we won't have negative equity. And in fact, I think more and more the government's policies are completely based on the only thing that matters is let's keep house prices moving upwards, despite the enormous cost of them. Okay, so that's the idea, that the economy will boom, house prices continue to move up, the guarantees are not a problem. What worries me is what happens if that isn't the case? What happens if, in fact, the economy doesn't continue to expand? What happens if house prices actually start to fall, even, dare I say it, in London? What happens then? Well, basically, we could end up with a position where part of the mortgage isn't covered. The idea is that the borrowers who've deposited 5%, that they lose their 5%. The taxpayer have guaranteed essentially another 15%. It's not quite that amount because of the detail of the scheme, but say 15%. And then the lender, the bank, or whatever, loses up to the other 80%. Okay, so what's clear is that the government have given this guarantee on these mortgages of 15% of the amount that's been borrowed. Okay, that's pretty uncomfortable from my perspective, but also it seems to me there is potentially a possibility that this other 80% ends up with the taxpayer as well. So the way I'm thinking is, supposing there's a serious collapse in house prices, how long is it before the bank starts saying, oh yeah, but the only reason we gave these mortgages was because they were partly guaranteed by you, that you gave us assurance that it was going to be okay, and therefore you covered part of the you guaranteed part of the 20% deposit, and starts putting the government, the taxpayer, through the courts for that. So that makes me nervous. I worry about that 80%. Maybe I shouldn't worry, because I seem to recall the Prime Minister being on the TV several months ago, being asked about this scheme, and he said, look, there's no problem. He says the scheme has been very carefully thought out, and it will be applied very carefully, so there won't be any losses. Okay, so let's just get this clear. This is a scheme based on the concept that the banks will take prudent and careful decisions so that losses don't fall on the taxpayer. Right, okay. Yeah, right, Dave. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, mate. Yeah. Let's go on to nuclear power. There's been a lot of publicity recently about the Hinkley Point nuclear power station. The government have agreed a scheme whereby essentially they guarantee the energy prices from this nuclear power station for I think up to 50 years has been quoted, okay, by guaranteeing a price that actually is at the moment significantly above the market price. This is quite an interesting scheme. It seems to me what it encourages, it means that this public sector, this public service asset, this power station will be built. It means that there's no public sector cash to be paid up front. And because it's a guarantee, these obligations won't